Hello and welcome to Frame to Frame, part of the We Made This podcast network. We are the podcast that take two seemingly unconnected films and slam them together like a gavel on a sounding board. I'm Andy Williams,
And I'm Sean Wilson.
and this week we're going to be bringing you two films which are told in real time. So we're going to be looking at 12 Angry Men from 1957 and Run Lola Run from 1998. So a lot of time passed between these two films using a very, very similar technique.
Yeah, and this is interesting the way that these films use cinematic mediums show how malleable time can be. Because we've got used to this with Christopher Nolan having popularized it in the last sort of 20 odd years, from Memento onwards. But it shows there was a real precedent for messing around with the subjectivity of time, and looking forward to getting stuck into these two. Should be good fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. But I'm just curious: I'm assuming you've seen both of these films before the podcast, right?
I'd seen Run Lola Run before. I watched that at university. I'd never seen 12 Angry Men before. This was a big gap in my film watching knowledge. So that's why I
Okay.
like doing this. I like catching up on things. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm the exact same as you. I watched Run Lola Run quite a few times in university, and hadn't seen 12 Angry Men before. And I was talking to some of the other people on the We Made This network, and they basically called 12 Angry Men one of the greatest films of all time. So yeah, why don't we start there? That's a good a place as any. So this is being called the greatest film of all time by other people. So 12 Angry Men is based on a 1954 teleplay by Reginald Rose. It's directed, believe it's the first feature film directed by Sidney Lumet, and he would then go on to direct some real sort of classic films. The original Murder on the Orient Express being one, Dog Day Afternoon, The Wiz, Before the Devil Knows You're Dead with
Serpico.
Philip Seymour
Serpico's classic.
Serpico. Yeah, absolutely. Network, which we've previously covered on this podcast. I mean, all sorts of great films. So he's a very, very well renowned filmmaker, and for good reason. And this was his film debut. So there isn't really much plot to talk of, except that there is a murder trial, and the jury has been sent to deliberate their conviction. And they then basically discuss the case that they've heard. And the question comes as to what the basis of reasonable doubt actually is. But throughout the conversations, there's so much more of that comes out from these people. So there's a discussion of prejudice, there's discussions of bias, that the whole notion and idea of reasonable doubt. So before we dig into the film anymore, Sean, have you ever done jury service?
I was hoping you'd ask that. Yes, I have. I did it about 10.5 years ago at Exeter Crown Court. Yeah, it's a odd experience. I mean, it's considerably less dramatic and considerably less stylish than what this film plays out. It's sort of less sweaty as well. Although it wasn't a hot day when I did it, so thank God for that, because it looks quite unbearable the way the film depicts it. It's a curious. I mean, one of the things that the film gets right is that atmosphere of that unknowable atmosphere. The fact you are literally thrown against your will into a small room with a group of people you don't know. You don't know him from her. You've got no idea who these people are, what their proclivities are, what their principles are, and yet you're supposed to come to some kind of an accord about a very, very important bit of information, and that is a really surreal thing. Because I don't know you from Adam. I don't know if you share my sensibilities, my outlook on life. But I've now got to reach some kind of a pact with you and everybody else, and there's a very condensed time frame in which you have to do it, and it's a brilliant concept for a film to alight on. I think it's very, very relatable. I mean, the case that I was on was actually deeply unpleasant, and it was so unpleasant that because ordinarily what happens is you have a block of time for jury duty. I mean, I was meant to have had 2 weeks, and this case was deemed so unpleasant that the judge basically said to us, the jury, right, you can now sit out the rest of your jury service because I appreciate this has been very arduous and very nasty, and it's not been easy to come to a decision. So there was that, but yeah, it's quite. Have you done it? It's quite surreal.
I have. So similar to you, I had the allotted 2 weeks. I had two cases, one of which was sort of deeply unpleasant, and the other one which was slightly less so, as these things go. And oddly enough, this makes me sound properly grandstanding, but the 12 Angry Men situation kind of happened in that second case. And I was juror number 8. I
Oh,
was
so
Henry
you're right.
Fonda.
So you're Henry Fonda. You are putting yourself as forward as the blue-eyed liberal Hollywood movie star in that really. Okay, fair enough. Well, yeah. I can see
Yeah.
that.
So basically, it was a question of whether someone had or had not taken something. Basically, and I didn't believe that he did. And everyone, there was the one guy who took the role of the foreman. He was just sort of like, but how? What are you basing that on? So similar to the film, I was then going through the case saying like, well, I don't believe that happened, and I believe the defense, and I can't tell you beyond reasonable doubt that this has happened. It didn't resolve itself in the same way that 12 Angry Men did. I think we ended up as a hung jury, but there we are.
What you wanted was a big sweeping crane shot and a big surging, like, sort of a bit of orchestral music, didn't you, to try and see out your verdict, and you were denied that.
Would have been
I'm guessing.
nice.
Yeah.
Would have been nice, but no. So yeah, it's very strange having sort of going to watch this, and if there was anyone that had seen this film in that jury service, they would then be like, "Well, you've just seen 12 Angry Men. That's all you're doing."
One of
But
the
no, I was
things I
just a stuck-up 20-year-old, I think.
one of the things I remember was that the case that was quite contentious. So that we came to an agreement quite quickly in our jury room, but it was a difficult verdict to sit with afterwards, given the nature of
Mm,
the case. And I remember afterwards the family of one of the people involved in it were hanging around outside the courtroom, and we all of us jurors were actually audibly hanging back inside, going, "Okay, I really don't think
mhm,
they're going to be very happy with us," and we were all kind of actually quite scared about going outside, and we had to sort of wait
mhm.
until they dispersed. It's like, work quickly, like, run for it. That was quite a strange thing. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm surprised that they let the people from the court case just mingle outside the court while we came out. I mean, I'm surprised they didn't scuttle us out the back route or something. But they didn't do that. But yeah, it was weird. But,
yeah. No, I had a similar experience, and some other members of the jury just sort of went past, and there was nothing. But
mm.
once again, I was 20 years old, so I was not in a mindset to be confronted with anything unpleasant. But anyway, we're sidetracking slightly. To 12 Angry Men, we're going to be talking about the verdict of the film. We're going to be talking about the whole thing. So I really, really hope that anybody listening to this, or indeed watching this, has seen the film. Otherwise, we're going to ruin it for you. But what I really, really loved the most about 12 Angry Men is just how cinematic Sidney Lumet made this film. It's ostensibly 12 men in one room talking. So, as far as dramatic constructs go, you've got your characters all in one place. You've got just basically the plot being talked to each other. But what he manages to do with the cinematography, the score, the iconography sort of outside of the room, he manages to really take us on the journey that these characters do as well. And I think the way that happens is that, to begin with, the shots are relatively open. You know, you see the whole room, you see the men together. I think when you actually see them in the courtroom, the camera's panning across, and we're being introduced to them individually. But then towards the end, as things sort of ramp up and get much more tense, you have extreme close-ups, you have blurred backgrounds, and literally just the faces of the men in the foreground, and they're in focus. And I really think that the way that Lumet managed to do that is just astounding. You can completely see how he went on to have the career that he did, because to make what is pretty much a stage play this cinematic is a crowning achievement.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting film, and I'm really glad to have finally watched it. I mean, to reinforce the theme of this episode, that there are two ellipses. So you've got the camera cranes up to the edifice of the court at the beginning. We then cut inside the court. The camera cranes down to give a sense of how the people are kind of dwarfed by the structure of the legal system, which I thought was a really great thing. Then there is the move to the interior of the court. Then you get the ellipsis that takes us into the jury room, which is where, as far as for the purposes of this podcast is concerned, that's where the real time situation begins. And then all of the jury deliberations take place during the course of, real time. And it's interesting because these are very, very, again, it's a very universal situation. These are very ordinary men who have got a very limited amount of time to come to an incredibly important decision. And I really think it's fascinating that the film, which is based on the earlier teleplay, is condensed like that, because you do get a real sense of ticking clock urgency about it. And the spectrum of responses is, I think, really, really well handled. Again, you've got Henry Fonda, who's the nominally liberal, upstanding architect, who's like, hang on a minute, we need to take a closer look at the evidence, because we could be sending a young guy down for, so that we could be sending a young guy to the chair here on the basis of what we say. And then on the other hand, it's kind of like, well, if we don't, if we don't find him guilty, then then we might have potentially let a murderer loose on the streets. And I remember grappling with all these thoughts and feelings when I was on jury duty. It's kind of like, okay, however way you cut it, this situation is not ideal, and we've now been placed right into the middle of it, and finding a decision that is going to upset the apple cart in one way or the other. And I think the film puts you in that very, very delicate moral position actually really, really well. And like I said, the cross section of emotions, like the one juror, I think juror number 7, I forget the actor's name, is completely indifferent to the proceedings and just wants everything to be wrapped up and to go to the baseball game, which is very sort of recognisably.
That's Jack Warden.
Jack Warden, he's really good, and it's a callous response, but it's a callous response that you can kind of recognise. And I love the symbolism, the fact that it's everyone is sweating, that it's building up to this brewing storm that's both literal and figurative, and then when it starts raining, you get a sense of a cleansing rain that's washing away a lot of their moral quandaries, and it helps bring them to some kind of a resolution. I love that isn't too heavy-handed. It's not as heavy-handed as I've just described it. It is more subtle within the context of the scene, but yeah, I think it's a terrific film. You can see why it's held in such high regard.
Yeah, even though, I mean, it was a flop pretty much on release. It was released in a time where black and white movies were sort of on the way out, and they were seen as yesterday's sorts of films. And it was responded very well with critics, but it wasn't so well received by audiences. Because, I mean, it was nominated for a whole host of Academy Awards, and it's sort of very, very well regarded with, like I said, with critics, but it was a box office disappointment. And, it wasn't a widescreen production. And then when it aired on television, that's when it began to really pick up its pace. But you mentioned the rain, and I think that that's something that is done extremely well in the film, in that we're shown the passage of the time by the darkening of the outdoors and the intensity of the rain and the weather and the storm. It's the way that the sweatiness and the moisture and the room, and you can really feel it. It sounds gross to say, but you can really smell that room, where you've got this anger happening and this really intense discussion. I really like the fact that, as well, Henry Fonda produced this film. So this was the first film he ever produced, and he just, you could tell that he was bringing a lot of himself into this role, that he was extremely at home playing juror number 8, being the relatively sort of level-headed and the person to just say, right, no, I want justice. I don't necessarily want a guilty verdict just to leave. I want to discuss this. And he just wants to go through the evidence again. He's a very, very thoughtful man. And, it clearly did some wonders for him, even though he vowed never produce a movie again, because if he was to fail as a producer, then that might not help his acting work. But yeah, I really think that 12 Angry Men holds up extremely well, and I do think that what you bring to it as an audience member, and I think this for most films, but especially for this, the experiences you bring to it will influence what you take away from it. So you and I, having both gone through jury service, will be able to recognize certain aspects of it and really connect with certain bits of it. But I just wanted to highlight the moment where juror number 10 goes on this horrendous, xenophobic, racist, disgusting rant. And you could look at things from a similar time period of 1957 and sort of say, different times, different people. But what I really, really like is that the camera pulls back and it shows the men having stood up and turned their back on him, because he's just talking a diatribe of nonsense. And to have called out these attitudes at that time, I think that it was a very bold move to make.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because courtroom dramas were becoming a lot more bold in dealing with the less than savoury aspects of day-to-day life. You think of 2 years later, Anatomy of a Murder came out, the Otto Preminger film starring James Stewart, which had very graphic language. Like, I think that was the first American movie to use the word rape, I think, which hadn't been used in films, certainly not regularly up until that point. And it's interesting that film broke down boundaries, as did 12 Angry Men. The idea that you're dealing with people
And
who are
5 years later, To Kill a Mockingbird.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in 12 Angry Men, you're dealing with people who are palpably mercurial and at loggerheads with each other, and are tussling with their own sense of humanity. I mean, yeah, called Ed Begley as juror number 10 is really, really impressively off-putting in this. Again, because it feels like a very human performance of a very, very weak man who is put in this situation with other people, but he's got to shoulder just as much responsibility as everybody else, as does juror number 3, played by Lee J. Cobb, who's another of the vaguely like gobshiting, annoying, loudmouth jurors. And I mean, you don't have to have been on jury duty to have come across people like this. But there is, I mean, Lee J. Cobb was in. He was in On the Waterfront, and he was a genuine nasty piece of work in that. I mean, he was a villain in that. He's not a villain in this. He's more of just a weak, sort of slightly spineless, compromised man. You shook your head there when I said he's not a
definitely
villain.
the antagonist.
Yeah, I mean, you can be
Yeah, he is
antagonistic.
the
That doesn't make you
antagonist
a
of the film,
villain.
isn't he? He's the one. No, but he's the one that our hero is going against. He's the last holdout to the guilty verdict. He's the man that we basically need to convince. And there is that scene within the film where juror number 8 he winds him up, and he makes the point of winding him up to specifically get him to say that I'm going to kill you, which is something that was overheard during the actual case. And just to make the point of, people say this in anger, and just because you say that in anger, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've gone on to actually commit said murder. Um, but yeah, I just think that the way that it's shot is very clearly the key to this film. So let's shout out the cinematographer of Boris Kaufman there. But you always have a thing or two to say about a score. So you tell me a little bit more about the Kenyon Hopkins score.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with Kenyon Hopkins, who's a jazz composer apparently, and he did a handful of films, as I've mentioned several times recently on this podcast. Actually, around jazz came into film music with A Streetcar Named Desire, which was 2 years before this. No, so several years before this, beg your pardon. And that was composed by Alex North, and there were a lot of other jazz scores around this time. Think of Elmer Bernstein with The Man with the Golden Arm and Sweet Smell of Success. And again, to go back to Anatomy of a Murder, that was scored by Otto Preminger. So I thought the score was impressive in this. It doesn't sound jazzy. It sounds sort of chamber orchestra size. It's not jazzy and it's not symphonic, because that would just be inappropriate, because the dimensions of the room they're occupying don't necessarily demand a big sweeping orchestra, although the final movement where Henry Fonda is walking down the steps, that does allow itself a degree of catharsis, because you think, okay, the deliberations are over and now you can breathe a little bit, and that's a classic move that many film composers indulge in. I thought the score was very good. It's not a film of music. It's a film of dialogue. Like, the dialogue is the musicality. Let's be honest, because music would just be an imposition. It would get in the way, and there's too much dialogue for you to pay attention to for the music to be necessary, really. But no, I did appreciate the score. Again, not being particularly familiar with Kenyon Hopkins necessarily. I just, on the subject of the acting, I just wanted to call out two more actors who I thought were particularly good in this. Jack Klugman as juror number 5, who is the guy who grew up in the slum and who kind of maybe has a better understanding of impulses and motivations relative to the case that they're deliberating. The idea of, can someone truly murder someone? Well, you've got to know their background first, and he being someone who grew up in the slums is maybe better positioned than anybody else to understand that, because he's had a tough upbringing and he knows people who have murdered. He's lived in those tough environments. I thought he was terrific. Also, Joseph Sweeney as juror number 9, who's ultimately named as McArdle in the final scene when he walks out with Henry Fonda's character, who's subsequently revealed to be called Davis. He was really good. Just a real principled voice of reason, and decency. I thought those two performers were really good, and they brought a lot of humanity, a lot more additional humanity to this, I thought.
Yeah, I think that it's a film and a teleplay that sort of rises and falls on the basis of its cast, because the dialogue is the dialogue. That's a great story, no matter who's playing it, if you see what I'm saying. But to elevate it to how it's got, we point at Sidley Lumet and the way that he managed to film this and actually make it cinematic. But it has to be great performances, and we're lucky enough that this film has them. And you've already shouted out Lee J. Cobb as juror number 3, as well as Henry Fonda and Joseph Sweeney and Ed Begley and Jack Klugman. And I think that we need those characters to be as strong as they are, especially seeing as they're unnamed. You know them roughly by face rather than by name. Even now, to break the fourth wall somewhat, I've got the cast list in front of me with the pictures of them next to the names, because I wouldn't be able to tell you who juror number 3 was, because that ultimately doesn't matter. You go, oh yes, it's that guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's true, and I think that the film has got a really admirable way of creating suspense out of dialogue set pieces, because obviously it's driven by its dialogue. There's a brilliant bit where they're trying to work out whether the someone could have walked out of a particular room, down a hallway, through their front door, and down the staircase in an alleged amount of time. And the way that Lumet uses the cinematic space, and Henry Fonda is the character, Davis is the character who is testing this out. And Lumet chooses very, very deliberately the moments to push in on Henry Fonda's feet as he's walking up and down, in order so they can time it and test this theory, which will then potentially throw some eyewitness testimony into doubt, or not, as the case may be. And the way that the camera holds back and pushes in at certain points is, like you said earlier, is really, really critical, and that becomes amplified as the film goes on, which I think is really, really great. I mean, bearing in mind that 90% of this film takes place in one room, with the exception of the beginning and the end bit, and there's also one scene where it goes into the bathroom that joins on the juror deliberation room. Yeah, it's a really impressive film. It's very gripping, really gripping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think that the fact that it's lasted for as long as it has and it's now viewed as a classic, the great film critic who we've brought up on a few occasions, Roger Ebert, called it one of his great movies. It's one of the few films that holds a 100% approval rating on the website Rotten Tomatoes, which for those interested, Citizen Kane now does not. Because Paddington 2 is now the greatest reviewed film of all time, according to Rotten Tomatoes.
I'm not arguing with that.
Me either. Just for
No.
that dance sequence at the end alone, or the musical
Yes.
sequence at the end. So it's been screened in secondary schools. It's juror number 8 has been listed as one of the great movie heroes. It's been listed by the AFI as one of the most inspiring films of all time. As I mentioned, it was nominated for a few Academy Awards, including Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Writing of an Adapted Screenplay, where it lost to Bridge on the River Kwai in all 3 categories, interestingly enough. So, it's had that impact. And in doing a bit of research for the podcast, I read that Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was actually directly influenced by this film to pursue a career in law. And it was juror number 11's monologue on his reverence for the American justice system that actually inspired her. And to think of the real life impact that this film has had, like, it is just a film at the end of the day, but to have had such a direct impact on somebody who is now a Supreme Court justice it's quite astounding. It's bigger than the film itself to have influenced the real world in that way. But what I really like about both of the films we're going to be discussing is just how simple the plot is. We can sum this plot up so easily, and I think that's a trope that's required for a real time basis. If you're telling the film in real time, you have to be able to sum it up quickly, because otherwise you've got Crank or something like that. Whereas in
someone stole my strawberry tart. Sorry.
Oh dear, Statham popped in for a minute.
Yeah, sorry, he's gone again now.
In this, we've got 12 people in a room talking about something. Whereas when we look at Run Lola Run, you've got basically people just need some money in the case of 20 minutes. But just the final word on 12 Angry Men. I think it really is an enduring classic. It still holds up today. I was a little bit worried that watching a film about 12 white men in a room might not age particularly well. And I think that what holds true is it does have the difference of attitudes, and it directly discusses them and deals with them in a relatively modern way, I guess, in a way that is still looked at as quote unquote right way of dealing with that today. And, just sort of directly challenging the views that you don't necessarily agree with. So I really, really liked it, and I can completely see why it's being listed as one of the great films of all time. So, when Tony from the We Made This Podcast Network listens to this, then he will feel vindicated in the opinion of it being one of the great films of all time, I'm sure. But now we're going to look at Run Lola Run, which is directed by Tom Tykwer. I believe that's how you say the name.
Tykwer, I believe it is.
Tykwer. Yeah. I will bow to your superior knowledge on this. So directed by Tom Tykwer in 1998. Sean, why don't you tell us a bit about it?
So this was, as I mentioned, I saw this at university, and it kind of hits you in a blast of energy. I'm sure you found this as well when you first watched it. Right, it's a real just energetic sprint of a film, as the title implies. So it stars Franka Potente as the flame-haired Lola of the title, who is a woman in Berlin who gets a call at the beginning of the movie that her boyfriend Manny, played by Moritz Bleibtreu, who is a bagman for a local gangster, has lost some money that he was meant to be taking to this gangster, and they are unsurprisingly, he is now under threat of death. He is, I believe, 100,000 Deutschmarks down. And he doesn't know what to do. He's calling Lola from a phone box. Remember when people used to use those? I mean, that's one of the many ways you can tell this is a 1990s staple. He's calling from a phone box. Okay, there are a lot of 1990s sort of enjoyably like nostalgic 1990s staples in this film.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I mean, Local Hero has a phone box as one of the central parts of the film. The film that we talked about last week, Local Hero, and
yeah. Well,
I think that it delightfully ages something. So there's an element of happy nostalgia for that, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose in Local Hero, the person going by on the moped might have been in a bit of a hurry to go and deliver some money to somebody else off screen, but I don't know. There could be a whole other story going on there. Who knows?
Run Lola Run in rural Scotland,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'd be quite an interesting experience.
directed by Bill Forsyth.
Yeah, exactly. They'd just be a lot more gentle. Can we just sit down and have a cup of tea about it? We don't need to kill each other. There'd be a lot more of that going on, or maybe a whiskey. Yeah. So what happens is, so Lola gets this call from Manny at the beginning. He's absolutely distraught. She then says to him, "Don't worry, I will get the money to you." And the story, so the narrative then essentially fragments. What you get are three iterations of Lola either attempting to or actually succeeding in getting the money to Manny in various ways. And each of these narratives plays out across the course of 20 minutes, hence the real time, hence why we're talking about it. So you get that sense of verisimilitude, and that within each of these three time frames that the clock is, we often casually say in a film the clock is ticking, and we mean it in a really casual, figurative sense. In this sense, the clock really is ticking, and it really is playing out in something that approximates real time. And there are what happens is, as Lola runs through Berlin. I mean, I love the way this film uses Berlin as well, because Berlin is a fantastic city, and it's really great how they use locations in this film. Various It's almost like a butterfly effect. The various people that she crosses paths with, either directly or indirectly, their fate is shown to have her sprinting past them has a direct impact on their fate. So as she runs past certain people, the narrative will digress to go to a series of snapshots about that person, detailing like what happens in their life. So it's a really interesting commentary on free will, on predeterminism. The idea is there ever only one fate decided for us, or are there several different avenues that we can sprint down? Anyone, which of those avenues is the one that's going to determine the course of our life? I mean, I suppose when I was watching it, weirdly enough, I was thinking of Terminator 2, that line, "There's no fate but what we make for ourselves." There's that classic thing, it always goes through like a lot of science fiction films. But yeah, and in at least two iterations of Lola's story en route to try and save Manny from the gangster, she goes to her father, who is a banker, or nominally her father. She goes to the bank to try and basically coerce a load of money out of him, and then in one of these stories, she finds out that he's not actually really her father, and he effectively disowns her, like, right, which creates a level of heartrending kind of disarray at the center of an already urgent narrative. So, and the film is brilliant. The film is, I mean, I think it's basically a German Danny Boyle movie, isn't it? I think that's the best way I can describe it. I mean, it uses a pulsating techno soundtrack. It uses different exposures, different zooms, different frame rates. It throws in bits of animation. At the start of each of the three stories, Lola is shown in animated form running down the staircase of her flat. I mean, I can only assume that maybe the reason why they might have thrown those little bits in is to maybe save on a little bit of budget. Maybe maybe it was a bit too complicated to do some of these things with actual real actors, so maybe let's throw in an animated bit. But it gives it a bit of spiky texture, and the opening credit sequence is animated as well. And yeah, just the idea that we could be hurtling towards the same destination in a multitude of different ways, and how that has a knock-on effect on everyone around us as well. I find it's a really interesting concept, and I think Tom Tykwer brings it across brilliantly, I have to say.
I mean, you've pretty much stolen the thunder of all of my notes, my pre-planned notes, ahead of that in what
I
you just
mean,
said.
it's either that or the word is simpatico. We're simpatico.
Sure,
Yeah, let's
let's
go
go
with
with
that.
that. So I've got a couple. I've still got a couple of things
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah. I
say,
haven't stolen all
but
of them.
yeah, the whole idea of free will versus determinism. For long-time listeners of this podcast, that's what I wrote my university dissertation on, the concept of free will. And yeah, the fact that it is such a forefront in this film is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's got some really interesting things to say in that regard. Because the thing that stuck with me though is whether you think that Lola actually remembers the previous iterations, because we as an audience will feel a different way towards the father character after the first iteration, because we now know the type of person that he is. So we feel a lot colder towards him. Therefore, when bad things start happening to him, we're relatively happy about that. So it's a question as to whether Lola's aware of that. And I quite like the ambiguity of her not really knowing. But yeah, the butterfly effect shots as well, I thought were very, very intelligently used, because these three different outcomes of a man's life that just happened to have stolen a bicycle and offered it to Lola, and based upon her response, he could have three different lives. It's crazy, but the film is so 90s, isn't it? It's
Oh yeah, yeah.
you mentioned Danny Boyle, and I was going to mention Train Spotting, which is again the direct illusion, where, and because there's literally a shot in this film where a car comes out from underneath a tunnel and hits Lola, which is, I mean, that's got to be a direct callback to Train Spotting, right? But I don't think that's the only film that gets an homage in this. I think Vertigo does too.
Oh yeah,
Not
yeah.
least because of the fact of number one, running down the staircase, and number two, there is actually a Vertigo poster on her wall. But there is a constant image of spirals. The bar that's behind the phone box is actually called Spiral. I just think that, yeah, it's just something that struck me watching the film, was they're very reminiscent of Vertigo, whether that was intentional or not. But the style, the fashion, the music, it's so 1990s.
You mentioned the fashion there. I mean, you see Manny at one point, he's wearing a pair of jeans and he's got a chain hanging out the back of them. I remember friends at school who styled themselves exactly like that, with the big chain hanging down the back. I was like, that's not something you really see anymore. It was all the skating lot at school always used to dress
I
like
had
that.
one. I had one.
So yeah, so that was probably profoundly nostalgic for you then, seeing that little detail.
Well, it's odd. So I remember this poster. I remember seeing this poster from such a young age that I don't know where I saw it, because I was convinced it was in something like Friends or something like that, and I was doing some research ahead of time trying to place where I saw it, and I couldn't remember. And the only thing I could think of was that we had before we had a Blockbuster, we had a local video store, and I think the poster must have been up in there, because that image of her running
with
with
the red
red
hair,
hair
yeah,
and
yeah.
the green jeans, and I know that I've seen that, and it's basically burned into my memory, but I don't know from where. So this film has sort of been in my head clearly from a very young age, but yeah, I think that it's delightfully postmodern in that sense. I think the characters are seemingly, I've sort of touched on this, is seemingly aware of the abilities. But what I like is that the narrative makes them, in every step of the way, they're always underdogs, which makes them very, very easy to root for. They're the people that shouldn't be winning on the roulette. They're people that, even she's trying to rob a bank at a certain point, and you're not only are you on her side at succeeding robbing the bank because it's her horrible stepfather's, but then when she escapes and she's surrounded by police, you're like, oh, how are we going to get out of this? Oh,
Yeah,
cool. Okay, we're just going to run away, and you're still on
yeah.
her side. Like, I think that is a real part of the film that should be lauded, is the fact that no matter what, you really want Lola to get Manny's money. But I really like as well the things that intersperse the three stories, that you have the discussions of Manny and Lola in bed, and they open up a lot more about the characters. And I like that there is that moment to it. in wrestling, you'd call it a let me up, right? It's so you have a ridiculously amazing match, and then you can't have another ridiculously amazing match after that. You need a let me up, otherwise. Do you know what I mean? There's no correlation between the two. If you just constantly have amazing matches, that becomes the norm, right?
So basically,
So
you need a breather just to pace things
yeah,
a bit. What you're saying,
yes,
yeah.
that yeah. But I put it in a professional wrestling parlance because
Yeah, don't
why
don't
not?
don't look to me for that because I've no idea what you're talking about. So, yeah,
Scripted stories where people hit each other, Sean.
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah. It's yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the idea of the shared memory between the storylines because you've got the in one version of the story you need to take the safety catch off the gun. In the version of the story after that second one, she remembers to click the safety catch off the gun. The idea of the genetic memory maybe shared across all the various iterations of Lola. I mean, it's funny because Tom Tykwer went on to work with the Wachowskis on Cloud Atlas, which was adapted from the David Mitchell novel, which I think was a very ambitious, impressive, if ultimately failed attempt to adapt a very, very tricky novel. But it is admirable. But the idea in that there is one collective soul across several different generations, iterations throughout the decades, that's interesting. And I thought you can clearly see maybe some genesis of that in here. I think there are themes shared between Run
Yeah.
Lola Run and Cloud Atlas. The idea that you raised an interesting question there, like, is there some knowledge that's embedded in one version of the storyline that's then carried over into the second and third storyline? But Run Lola Run isn't glib enough to point that out. You take away from it what you will, um, which I think is fascinating. But the music the music in this is just superb. It's so important.
It's so 90s. It's
It,
so
it is,
techno
yeah,
90s.
it is. It's the kind of thing that Ewan
I don't mean that
McGregor.
in a bad way either.
No, it's the sort of thing that Ewan McGregor would be listening to in a club in Train Spotting. That very pulsating, electronica, almost like quasi underworld kind of music. But I mean, it's not just that. There are at one point the score was interrupted by "What a Difference a Day Makes" by Dinah Washington, which is one of my favorite songs. I think that's one of the most beautiful songs ever written, and it gives a very elegiac, melancholy resolution to the end of the first iteration of the story, which ends in violence and disaster. And I love how varied the soundscape is in terms of the music. Um, yeah, there was one element of the sound
Yeah.
design. Yeah, I was just going to say there's one element of the sound design that did amuse me, somewhat unwittingly, which was
Go on.
the the gun sound effects are quite clearly taken from GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. Which I did find kind of distracting, like, and I was expecting someone, like on GoldenEye in 64 when you shot someone and they were like that, and I was expecting those. I was expecting someone to make those noises, and like when she loads the gun at one point, it literally goes like that. I was like, okay, you've just taken that from the stock sound effects CD that you had lying around the studio when you were editing this film. Clearly, so that's a little glib. That's a glib little thing, but it's a low budget film, so we'll let them off it.
I mean, it's completely true. I mean, yeah, you mentioned on the budget there. It was a $1.75 million film that went on to gross somewhere in the region of 22.9 million, which is a ridiculous success, especially for a foreign film, for a subtitled film in the 90s. But I think what it speaks to is just how entertaining it is. It's easy for us to sit here and talk about the thematic elements of it, the free will, determinism, and all this sort of stuff. And that kind of runs over the fact that it is so fun. It's entertaining, and it is in a similar way to Speed, in a similar way to Crank. It's just it takes you straight up to 100 miles an hour and doesn't let you down um, until it really needs to, and then it charges you back up again. And it just does that for it's what 80 minutes, and it's just fantastic in the fact that it really, really takes you along along this ride with the characters, because it's one of the simple stories that you could look at, right? Two people need to get 100,000 Deutschmarks in 20 minutes. That's it.
Yeah, and and she's not a superhero. She's doing it in quite clumpy boots, and it's quite clearly Franka Potente doing it. I mean, clearly a lot of the success of the movie revolves around her. She's a very earthy, down to earth character. It's interesting that after this she was cast in The Bourne Identity, because clearly she became a real Euro indie cinema icon after this, and they obviously wanted to import that into Hollywood in The Bourne Identity, and it worked really well. One of the interesting things that I'd completely forgotten about was that there is actually a role in this for Sebastian Schipper, who went on to direct the real-time movie Victoria, which I'd completely forgotten that he was in this.
Really?
So there's a bit of a crossover there, because Victoria was one of the films that we were maybe.
Yeah, we were talking about doing that for this. There was a whole host of films that we could have done. Phone Booth was the original film. The genesis of this podcast was Phone Booth, because I wanted to watch Phone Booth, and then we went, "Oh, Run Lola Run's great," and then that had to be in. And then because I hadn't seen 12 Angry Men, and it was one I'd always wanted to see, I was like, "Oh, that's real time as well. Yes, let's." So then when I texted you, Sean, and said, "Why don't we do 12 Angry Men?" there was just resounding agreement. So yeah, that's a peek behind the curtain as to how the podcast comes to be.
Yeah.
And for next week's show, we're going to be looking at thespians turned action stars. So people that have started out with a really serious stagey career, and are not doing that anymore. Or are they? Have they gone back? We don't know. We don't necessarily want to ruin the films. As always, the films will be announced on Friday on our social media channels. You can catch us on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Letterboxd, we're on Facebook. You can email us. You can have a look at the wider We Made This network. Again, all of the information on us and on the wider network is part of the show notes for this podcast. If you are having the mispleasure of actually seeing us, then hello. It's nice to see you. This is the second time we've attempted to record a podcast, and that will be available on YouTube. But don't worry if you're just listening to it, you're not missing out on anything, except there might be a few edit points here and there. But if they're that good, you won't ever know about them. So next week we're going to be looking at thespians turned action stars. If you've got any ideas for podcasts for themes coming up, there's no such thing as a stupid theme, then please let us know. Give us a shout on any of the methods that we've mentioned. Alternatively, if you want to appear on an episode, then let us know your theme. Let us know the idea behind it, and then we'll see if we can make something work. Because hey, why not? We're willing to open this thing out nowadays. So yeah, just get in touch and we'll see what we can do. But until next week, again, where we will be talking about thespians turned action stars, I'm Andy Williams.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And please continue on listening to hear some of the other great shows on the We Made This podcast network. Bye-bye.